Continuing with the analysis, we will now discuss the physical reality of the journey itself.
And this is where the map truly comes alive. Our mission here is, well, it's razor focused. We are tracing the Israelites' physical pilgrimage out of Egypt
Through the Sinai?
through the Sinai and matching those foundational biblical events, the crossing, the mountain, the logistics, with solid archaeological and geographical evidence.
And crucially, we're doing this strictly within that framework we've been discussing, the new chronology.
Yes, placing everything in the Middle Bronze IIAB era. That's the key.
Right. Because if the geography and the timing don't work, the whole story just collapses, doesn't it?
It falls apart completely.
You mentioned this as a paradigm shift, moving these events back to that in-between era. What does that let us achieve that the traditional timeline never could?
Well, it allows us to trade the miraculous for the historical while still retaining the profound drama of the event. I mean, it's a huge shift in thinking. When you remove the narrative constraints of the later Egyptian periods, the Ramesside era everyone defaults to, you suddenly find that the ancient topography and the specific logistical demands of the Exodus align perfectly.
So you don't need these huge sensationalized events.
Exactly. We don't need exaggerated deep-sea splits or these impossible population movements. Instead, what we find are events that are rare, yes, remarkable, absolutely, but they're anchored precisely in the geography of the Bronze Age frontier.
Okay, let's unpack this journey then. Let's start right at the launch pad for this massive mobilization. Where exactly did, 35,000 plus people start their walk to freedom?
The sources are unanimous on this. They departed from Goshen.
Goshen.
The Egyptians knew this region as Gesemet or Pakazim. Today, we can pinpoint this firmly in the eastern delta, specifically the area of Everus.
Modern Tel Ed-Daba.
Modern Tel Ed-Daba, yes. And this identification is just crucial because Everus was the capital of the Hyksos, the Semitic rulers of Egypt, during that MB2 period.
So this wasn't just some random spot on a map.
Not at all. This was the epicenter of the Semitic community in Egypt. It gave the Hebrews a built-in infrastructure and, a social network to draw from.
So they're leaving from a region that is already culturally and ethnically sympathetic to them.
In a way, it's their home turf.
Right. And their first stop, according to the itinerary, is a place called Sukkot.
Correct. The first major waypoint was Sukkot, which is very strongly linked to modern Tel El Maskuta. And the name itself, it just gives away its function.
How so?
The Hebrew word Sukkot. It translates directly to temporary dwellings or booths.
Which, of course, gives us the name for the Jewish festival commemorating those years in temporary shelter.
Precisely. It was an encampment, a gathering point. It wasn't a city. And that immediately speaks to the logistics of the whole thing.
It sounds like they were in a hurry.
This wasn't a leisurely departure. The sources imply a really accelerated pace. They were traveling day and night, essentially fleeing the moment the opportunity arose.
Day and night.
And given the geography from Everus, this suggests an intensive, maybe 1-week journey just to reach the frontier zone and the sea.
A week of intense, continuous movement for thousands of people and their livestock. Sukkot, then, it sounds less like a stop and more like a critical staging area.
Absolutely. It wasn't just for the Central Hebrew tribal groups. You have to remember the Arab Rab.
The mixed multitude.
The other scattered Semitic slaves and displaced peoples throughout the region who decided, okay, we're going to. Sukkot was essential for mobilizing them. It was the final military and logistical gathering point before they hit that heavily guarded border.
Okay, so following this accelerated mobilization, they arrive at a place called Etham. What does this location tell us about the actual, power of the Egyptian state they're trying to escape?
Etham is the gateway to the serious confrontation. The word itself is Egyptian, ketem. It just means fortress or border control.
So a proper military installation.
Oh, absolutely. This was not just a checkpoint. This was a major military post guarding the western entrance to the Way of Shur.
The Way of Shur being the main highway, right?
Yeah.
The fastest, safest, most traditional route into Canaan. The route you would logically take to get to the Promised Land.
Exactly. It was the heavily protected route. Logically, the Israelites should have continued due north along this road. But this is where we encounter this highly unusual yet critical detail in the text.
The command for them to turn back.
The command to turn back. The biblical word is shub.
This seems completely counterintuitive for people who are trying to escape. I mean, why would Moses deliberately lead them into what looks like a trap?
This shub, this reversal, is key to validating the entire geographical narrative. I mean, think about it. If they continued north on the way of Shur, they would have been easily chased down and intercepted on open ground by the, frankly, superior Egyptian cavalry.
They'd have been sitting ducks.
Completely. By turning back and pivoting sharply south, Moses directed the massive column away from that open highway and toward the border canal systems and the vast marshy areas.
So if Pharaoh's pursuing forces were tracking them, what psychological conclusion would they have drawn from a maneuver like that?
They would have concluded the Israelites were utterly lost, disorganized, terrified.
Wandering in the wilderness.
Exactly. Pharaoh's intelligence reports would have stated that the Israelites were now geographically boxed in. They had the water barrier, this marshy sea, on one side, and the returning Egyptian forces positioned strategically to cut off any retreat back into Egypt.
So Pharaoh would have been confident.
Supremely confident. He might have even slowed his pursuit, convinced the geography had delivered his escaped slaves directly into his hands.
That completely shifts the narrative. It goes from a display of divine confusion to a brilliant, pre-planned military tactic, something designed to deceive the enemy about their true destination and their competence.
It was a tactical stroke of genius. It used the very geography designed to keep them in that extensive frontier system as their ultimate defense. And it sets the stage perfectly for the dramatic climax in this watery, fortified environment.
Let's transition then to that watery environment. The sources call it Section 2. Pi-Hairot, Migdol, and the Miracle of the Sea. When we talk about the border between Egypt and Sinai, we need to understand this was not a simple painted line on the ground.
Far from it. This boundary was a gigantic engineered defense. It was known as the Walls of the Ruler.
The Walls of the Ruler.
You have to picture a complex system spanning miles, interconnected canals, large natural lakes, fortified structures, all of it constructed upon a natural sandstone causeway that provided the only semi-dry path across.
And this is all designed to keep people out of Egypt.
To keep the Bedouins and other hostile groups out, yes.
And crucially, the sources mention that reconstructing this ancient geography required some pretty high-tech intervention.
Yes, and this is one of the most fascinating nuggets from the source material. Much of this ancient terrain is now obscured. It's covered by centuries of agricultural irrigation and modern development in the delta.
So how do you see past that?
Researchers used Corona spy satellite imagery.
Corona, from the Cold War.
Exactly. Taken back in the 1960s and 70s. This imagery has a unique ability to penetrate shallow sediment and reveal subsurface features, like old canal paths and foundations.
That's remarkable. So decades-old spy tech helped unlock the Exodus route. What did this imagery specifically reveal about the water system they would have encountered?
It confirmed the existence of this boundary lake system, which the Egyptians called Pashi-Hor.
The Lake of Horus.
The Lake of Horus, yes.
Right.
This was essentially a vast, low-lying lagoon or marsh that was partially open to the Mediterranean. It defined the eastern edge of Egypt's control.
So now we can start to pinpoint the biblical names. Let's start with Pi-Hairot.
Pi-Hairot is identified as the mouth of the canals, or Pi-Hakeroth. Geographically, it was the exact spot where the main crucial canal, which was known as Pakara, emptied its waters into that large marshy area.
And this marshy area is the key.
This area is the key to the entire Exodus. It is the famous biblical body of water, Yam Suf.
Yam Suf, which modern translations often just default to as the Red Sea, and that leads to all that chronological and geographical confusion, right?
It's the source of most of the confusion. The original Hebrew means Sea of Reeds.
The Sea of Reeds.
Precisely. And in this Middle Bronze framework, this specific area of Yam Suf is identified with the Egyptian Potchef, which corresponds to the wide, shallow mudflats of modern Lake Bala.
So Pi-Hairot is this narrow access point, right at the edge of this massive, reed-filled and extremely shallow, marshy zone.
Exactly, the perfect bottleneck.
And the surrounding fortifications, Migdol and Baal-Zephon, they would have completed the trap.
They formed the jaws of the trap. Migdol was the main military fortress to the east, designed to control access. Survey work points to a large structure known as Site T211 as the likely candidate for the earlier Bronze Age fortress.
And Baal-Zephon, that name sounds decidedly non-Egyptian.
It is, it's Semitic. Baal-Zephon was located at Tel Dafana, and it hosted a temple dedicated to the Canaanite god of storms, and the north, Baal-Zephon. Significantly, the Egyptians had syncretized this god with Seth, their own deity associated with chaos, turbulence, and the desert edge. It's a perfect fit for its location on the chaotic, turbulent, watery frontier of the Egyptian world.
So you have the Israelites hemmed in, A fortress, Migdol, a temple boundary marker, Baal Zephon, and the canal mouth, Kai-Hero.
It's a perfect trap. Or so the Egyptians thought.
This setting completely transforms how we understand the crossing of the Yam Suf. Instead of a deep ocean, we have a shallow, marshy lagoon. Let's focus on the actual biblical mechanism that's described.
The biblical text is explicitly detailed about the mechanism, and we really have to stick to it. It says a strong east wind blew all night long.
All night.
All night, causing the water to recede, exposing the lake bottom. The water only returned as the sun rose. This specific sequence is the key to unlocking the historicity of the whole event.
Okay, but we have to address the traditional famous image first. The Cecil B. DeMille image of the splitting of the deep Red Sea. Why does the new chronology and this geography reject that image so vehemently?
Because it's geographically and, frankly, scientifically impossible. If you look at the widely proposed alternative crossing points like the Gulf of Aqaba, the depths there exceed 2,500 feet.
2,500 feet.
No wind phenomenon, no matter how strong or how prolonged, could physically move that volume of water. The depth is simply too great to expose the bottom. That depiction is an exaggeration that developed over centuries of retelling, moving away from the reality of the Red Sea.
But if we apply that exact description, a strong, sustained east wind, to the actual geography of the Yam Suf, those Patu mudflats of Lake Bala, what happens?
It works perfectly. It's a known phenomenon called a wind set-down. When a powerful, sustained wind blows across a large, extremely shallow body of water, like a lagoon or a marshy lake, it forces the water mass to pile up on one side,
Creating a localized, rapid receding tide on the other.
Exactly. This would expose the lake bed, the thick, reed-filled mudflats, for a period corresponding exactly to the biblical description of all night long.
And this leads directly to the tragic downfall of the pursuing Egyptian chariot corps. Why were they so vulnerable to this specific type of terrain?
Well, this is the genius of the maneuver. The Egyptian war chariots were heavy, they were fast-moving military technology.
Perfect for dry, open ground.
Absolutely perfect for it.
Yeah.
When they saw the exposed lake bottom, they would have charged onto what looked like solid, albeit slightly damp, ground. But these were thick mudflats, possibly several feet deep beneath a thin, dried crust.
A heavy chariot moving at speed would immediately sink and just get mired in that.
Instantly, they would have been immobilized, rendered utterly useless, and as the sun rose, the wind would have dropped, and the water, no longer held back, would have rushed back in.
A flash flood, basically.
A localized flooding that would decimate the heavy, trapped force, drowning them in the mire. The entire event moves from an unprovable miracle of nature-defying physics to a brilliant tactical move, one that utilized rare but known hydrogeological conditions to destroy a trapped, technologically superior enemy.
So the source material validates the event, precisely because it rejects the popular myth.
That's the beauty of it. The details in the text make it more credible, not less.
That is a staggering rereading of one of the most famous events in history. Moving beyond the sea crossing, the Israelites entered a new phase, a journey into the vast, arid interior, the desert of sin.
And this begins the true challenge of the pilgrimage. The desert of sin corresponds geographically to the immense high-altitude arid plains, specifically the Wadi Assuq, leading toward the southern granitic mountains, the Gebel Musa region.
Now we have to confront the biggest logistical hurdle of all population. The traditional number is often stated as 2 million or more. How large was this population under the revised chronology, and why is that shift so important?
The traditional number is utterly unsustainable in any desert environment. I mean, it's just not possible. And frankly, impossible to move across a single crossing point in one night.
Right.
The source material argues for a critical revised interpretation of the Hebrew word elef. Instead of interpreting elef as thousands of people, it should be understood in its military and organizational context as commanders of troops or, units.
So we're changing the scale of the operation by a factor of hundreds.
Exactly. By recalculating the tribal contingents that are listed in the Book of Numbers chapter 1 using this definition, the total fighting force is dramatically reduced. It comes down to approximately 6,148 men.
6,000 men.
Right. And once we account for women, children, the elderly, and importantly, the Arab, that mixed multitude, we arrive at an estimated total population of around 35,000 people.
35,000 people. Now that is still an enormous mobile city, but it's a fundamentally manageable number in terms of logistics.
It becomes plausible.
So what does that population number tell us about the pace of the journey?
It suggests the pace we discussed earlier is achievable. They traveled for roughly a month, covering the distance from Goshen to the desert of Sin. A group of 35,000 people moving daily, especially with livestock, is still a massive challenge, but it is one that a nomadic group accustomed to arid regions could accomplish.
And the primary constraint for any desert journey is always water. This must have dictated their choice of route through the Sinai.
Absolutely. To sustain 35,000 people, plus their essential livestock, the great deal of cattle mentioned in the text, they couldn't linger in the northern, truly desolate parts of the Sinai.
There's just nothing there.
Nothing. They had to travel south to the only region capable of supporting them, the granitic mountains of the southern Sinai, the Gebel Musa region.
Why is this specific region so unique in the Sinai Peninsula?
It's a geographical anomaly. The region surrounding Gebel Musa is uniquely rich in water sources because of its geology. The area is known to feature 4 running streams, countless springs, and excellent pasture lands, especially in the high plateau areas.
So it's an oasis on a huge scale.
It is. This resource density was absolutely crucial for nomadic shepherds. It is, quite simply, the only place in the entire peninsula where you can support a sustained encampment of that size for an extended period.
And this choice of destination? It aligns perfectly with the background of their leader, Moses.
It connects seamlessly. Remember, Moses spent 40 years exiled in the land of Midian, which borders the northwest Arabian region, working as a shepherd for Jethro. Shepherds are masters of finding pasturage and water. Moses knew this land intimately.
And you mentioned a connection to the earlier Egyptian stories, like Sinuhe.
Yes, the detail of Moses, the Egyptian-raised prince, spending decades abroad with a Bedouin chief. It's so specific to the cultural context of the Middle Kingdom that some scholars argue it was directly influenced by the well-known Egyptian narrative of Sinuhe.
Who was also an exiled court official.
Exactly. Sinuhe also lived among the Bedouin chiefs before eventually returning to Egypt. This detail just reinforces the deep literary and historical integration of the Exodus narrative within that Embiid-Sika Egyptian sphere. It's a perfectly pastoral and geographical story.
Now we arrive at the monumental event of the pilgrimage. The receiving of the law at the sacred mountain. We have to address the location of Mount Sinai, or Horeb. Where do the sources land in this huge debate?
The sources overwhelmingly favor the traditional location, Gebel Musa, in the southern Sinai Peninsula.
And the primary reason is the one we just discussed.
It's the water. Its unique, unparalleled capacity for sustaining a large nomadic encampment thanks to its extensive water supply and excellent pasturage.
But the popular alternative, Gebel el-Lawz in Saudi Arabia, gets a lot of attention in modern discussions. How do the sources address that counterclaim?
They dismiss it based on 2 main points, logistics and theology. While proponents of Gebel el-Lawz often cite modern rock scorch marks or volcanic ash as evidence of the fire on the mount, the logistical reality is that the region just lacks the necessary sustained water and pasturage.
Not enough to support 35,000 people.
Not for over a year. With all their herds, it's just not feasible.
And what about the theological contradiction? That sounds more definitive in this context.
It is. For me, it's the decisive blow. Proponents of Gebel el-Lawz point to certain rock formations there, claiming they are the 12 pillars mentioned in the text.
Okay.
However, the sources note that these pillars are clearly carved. They appear to be late Nabatean or Roman column drums, and this fundamentally contradicts the Mosaic law that was being established at that very moment.
Explain that fundamental theological clash. What's the problem with them being carved?
Mosaic law strictly, explicitly mandates that any sacred memorial stone, a masabah, must be natural. It must be untouched by a chisel or a hammer blow. The text is clear that the altar stones were not to be hewn. If Moses was establishing Yahweh's covenant and law, the absolute last thing he would use are pre-existing carved, man-made stones that violate the very principles he was trying to promulgate. The natural, untouched setting of Gebel Musa is consistent with the law being given. The carved pillars of Gebel el-Lawz are not.
That's a fascinating way to use a legal detail, the nature of the stones, to pinpoint the geographical likelihood.
It shows you the deep theological rigor embedded in the text itself.
Staying in this region, we encounter the infamous episode of the Golden Calf. This event has always puzzled scholars. I mean, why would a population that had just witnessed the destruction of Pharaoh's army turn so suddenly and dramatically back to idolatry?
The new chronology framework, and specifically the stop at Dofka, provides the complete logical answer. Dofka, a stop on their exodus route, is clearly identified as the Egyptian mining area known as Mofka.
Mofrika.
This encompasses the crucial sites of Serabit el-Qadim and Wadi al-Nazba. This whole region was the epicenter for turquoise and copper mining.
So the Israelites, moving south toward the sacred mountain, passed directly through a major industrial hub.
Exactly. And the population of this hub was critical. The workers in this region were skilled Semitic metal workers, very likely Kenites, the very group Moses' father-in-law Jethro belonged to.
So when the Exodus column passed through,
These skilled workers, part of that wider Arab Rab, they joined the migration.
so this infusion of new people added two crucial sudden elements to the Exodus population.
Two elements that are absolutely necessary for the Golden Calf incident to happen. First, they possessed the gold itself, likely the wealth and jewelry looted from the Egyptians before they left.
Fix second.
And most importantly, they possessed the sophisticated technical skill, the metallurgical ability required to cast and fashion a large, detailed golden statue, a skill the general Hebrew shepherd population would simply not have had.
So the shift wasn't a sudden random decision by the original tribes, but a profound cultural and technical infusion from these new arrivals, these mining guilds.
That's the crux of the issue, and the religious aspect reinforces this entirely. The miners at Serabit el-Qadim had a powerful, established tradition of worship. They worshipped the Egyptian cow goddess Hathor, who they knew locally as the mistress of turquoise because she protected the mines.
Hathor, the cow goddess. So the imagery is right there.
It's right there. And Hathor was also directly equated with the Canaanite goddess Balat, or Lady, the female equivalent of Baal. This was a deep-seated cult of the bovine deity connected to wealth and prosperity, perfectly understood by these metalworkers.
And the resulting idol reflects this worship, specifically the gender of the deity.
This is the absolute core textual nuance that gets lost in translation. While the later Masoretic Hebrew text uses the masculine term agalim,
Calves or young bulls.
right, but the older, historically crucial accounts, specifically the Greek Septuagint and the writings of Josephus, they refer to the idol using the term domili.
What does domilies mean?
It means heifers, or female calves.
Female calves.
It is a monumental distinction. If the idol was a heifer, a female cow, it links directly and irrefutably back to Hathor, the cow goddess, the mistress of turquoise. It was a female representation, not a young bull.
Which solidifies the idea that this sudden, shocking shift away from Yahweh worship was driven by the strong recent cultural influence of the skilled Semitic metalworkers who joined at the mining hub of Dofka.
It's a perfect fit.
That one textual detail, heifer versus bull, recontextualizes the entire episode. It makes the Golden Calf incident a historical consequence of the composition of the mixed multitude rather than some inexplicable act of apostasy by the central Hebrew leadership.
It transforms an anomaly into an inevitability, given the geographical stop and the resulting cultural assimilation. The metallurgy, the gold, the skilled labor, and the specific deity worshipped all converge perfectly in the Middle Bronze framework.
That is truly compelling. So, following the dramatic events at the Sacred Mountain, the long period of wandering began, eventually ending the 40-year period. Let's look at the final stages of this pilgrimage and the key waypoints.
The latter part of the journey saw them traversing the vast plateaus of the northern Negev and then circling down. Two major geographical areas mark this later stage before reaching the Transjordan: Kadesh and the Araba Valley.
Where do the sources place Kadesh?
Kadesh is identified with Gebel Aidid, which is also known as Harkarkam, or the Mount of the Multitude.
And this site has provided some unique, almost breathtaking archaeological evidence.
It really has. An Italian archaeologist, Emanuele Anati, conducted extensive surveys there and discovered thousands of petroglyphs, rock carvings.
Rock carvings that align with the Exodus themes.
Remarkably so. Anati found rock art that appears to depict scenes consistent with the narrative, things like a staff turning into a serpent, which is Moses' miracle before Pharaoh, and carvings showing a figure holding a double tablet marked with 10 compartments.
Strongly suggesting the 10 Commandments.
The imagery is undeniable.
That sounds like a powerful physical confirmation. But you mentioned earlier the geography is a little tricky here.
It is. While Gebel Aidid offers this compelling thematic evidence, the sources caution that its water source isn't sufficient to sustain the entire 35,000-person multitude for a prolonged period.
So maybe not a long-term base?
It suggests it was likely a significant sacred waypoint, or perhaps a boundary marker, maybe Karka, the southern border of Judah, rather than a 40-year habitation zone.
And after that?
Following this point, the Israelites journeyed through the Araba Valley, the biblical desert of Zin, making their way down toward the Red Sea coast.
And that southward journey leads us to Mount Hor, the traditional site of Aaron's death.
The itinerary takes them through specific sites, including Jopatha, which is identified with the modern Sabka et Taba region, ultimately guiding them toward the port city of Ezyon Geber on the Gulf of Aqaba coast. And then, yes, Mount Hor.
Which is still identified today.
Yes, known today in Arabic as Gabal Harun, the Mountain of Aaron. It remains the traditional site of Aaron's death and burial, and it's marked by a recognizable 14th century Islamic sanctuary that sits right on top of the peak.
Just as we found with the golden calf, is there a linguistic or etymological connection regarding Aaron's name that reinforces this entire Semitic pastoral context?
There is a strong one, yes. Aaron's name may well derive from the Canaanite god Haran. Haran was a well-known deity of the arid lands, and critically, a specific protector of shepherds in the flock. This deity was even incorporated into the Egyptian pantheon during the New Kingdom period.
So the two leaders of the Exodus, Moses, the seasoned shepherd, and Aaron, whose name may link back to Huron, the protector of shepherds, are both deeply integrated into the Semitic pastoral culture of the region.
It binds the leadership firmly to the logistical realities of the journey. The entire geographical and cultural context, from the leaders to the locations to the reasons for the sudden burst of idolatry, it all speaks to a historical event deeply embedded within the Middle Bronze Age landscape.
This geographical deep dive has been absolutely transformative. I mean, by shifting the chronology back to that Middle Bronze IIAB era, the entire pilgrimage narrative suddenly aligns geographically and logically. It just makes sense.
It clicks into place.
We have a non-miraculous yet still incredibly dramatic explanation for the sea crossing on shallow mudflats. We have the logistics of sustaining 35,000 people in the water-rich southern Sinai.
We have the specialized skill and the cult practices necessary for the Golden Calf incident, tied directly to local mining hubs, and the cultural origins of the leaders themselves.
It's the difference between a theological fable and a historical event supported by a dense pattern of evidence.
It is. The Middle Bronze framework strips away the chronological impossibilities and leaves behind a compelling, coherent historical itinerary.
It is truly remarkable how the specific details in the text, like the gender of the calf or the direction of the wind, are the very things that unlock the physical truth of the event when you apply them to the correct Bronze Age map.
This is the power of synchronizing archaeology, topography, and textual analysis. When they all align, you know you're onto something real.
Next, we'll move on to the final part of the book, where we trace the evidence for the conquest of the Promised Land.
In this last part, we're going to talk about conquest.
Right, the fourth and final pillar of that whole Exodus story.
This is the big pivot point, isn't it? They go from this wandering throng of people in the desert.
For 40 years, yeah. And suddenly they're a structured military force led by Joshua.
And their one job is to seize the promised land of Canaan.
It's a complete transformation. From refugees and, survivors to a settled nation. This is supposed to be the founding of early Israel.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really just isolate that conquest narrative. We want to see if the actual physical archaeological record can back up this story of invasion and transition.
And as we've been doing, we're looking at it through the lens of the proposed new chronology, the NC.
Which argues that all this happened much, much earlier than people usually think.
Exactly. We're talking about the Middle Bronze Age, specifically MBIIB, so roughly the 17th, maybe 16th centuries BC.
And that is such a critical distinction because the standard timeline, what we call the conventional chronology or CC, places the conquest way later.
Oh, way later, right at the tail end of the Late Bronze Age. So 13th century BC, during the time of Ramses II and his successors.
But there's a huge, a central problem with that dating, isn't there? It's what's led most of mainstream archaeology to basically dismiss the book of Joshua as, well, as history.
Precisely. You really have to start there with what you could call the problematic consensus. This was established by giants in the field, people like Israel Finkelstein.
Right, and Finkelstein's work on the earliest Israelite settlements is famous.
It is. He looked at these Iron Age villages up in the Central Hill Country and concluded that these weren't the homes of foreign invaders.
He argued they were just indigenous Canaanites.
Yes, that they'd moved from the big coastal cities, which were declining, and just resettled inland.
So what he saw was population continuity, not a conquest.
Exactly. And that's what led him to his famous conclusion, that the biblical conquest was, and I'm quoting, a story that never happened.
But the issue isn't just the continuity, is it? It's the lack of destruction.
That's the other half of the puzzle. The biblical story is very explicit. It describes a sudden, widespread, and crucially, a simultaneous destruction of major fortified cities.
And then the Israelites move in right after.
Right. But if you stick to that 13th century BC date, you just don't see that in the ground. The fortified cities from that period don't have the right destruction layers.
In fact, a lot of them weren't even fortified cities at that point.
Many were just small villages or, in some very key cases, completely abandoned ruins.
So the fundamental question becomes, if the biblical story is true, it needs a specific geopolitical context. It needs a moment in time where massive fortified cities were all destroyed at once.
And did that happen in the late Bronze Age, which is the CC timeline? Or, as the new chronology suggests, does the Middle Bronze Age, the MBIIB period, give us that exact layer of devastation that everyone's been looking for?
Before we jump into the Middle Bronze Age evidence, which I know is really compelling, we have to kind of put the final nail in the coffin for the conventional chronology.
I think so, yes. We have to show why it's so fatally flawed. And not just from archaeology, but from the Egyptian historical record itself.
The very records that are supposed to be the anchor for the whole CC model.
The irony is, yes, the Egyptian sources actually create immediate fundamental problems for a 13th century conquest.
Which brings us directly to the Merneptah stele anomaly.
The famous one.
Yeah. So if we're working inside the CC model, the Exodus happens under Ramses II. That means the Israelites should be arriving in Canaan somewhere around, 1250 to 1230 BC?
That's the timeline, yes.
Yeah.
And Merneptah, who was Ramses' successor, was on the throne around 1209 BC, so just a couple of decades after the Israelites supposedly showed up.
And on his victory monument, the stele, he makes this famous boast.
Israel is devastated. Its descent is no more. He lists Israel right alongside other conquered places like Ashkelon and Gezer.
Okay, so let's pause on that. That's the crucial point. If the Israelites were this newly arrived, disorganized group of tribes that had just been wandering in the desert for 40 years, how, in maybe 20 years, could they have established themselves so thoroughly that they were a recognized political entity, one significant enough for a pharaoh to boast about crushing?
It just doesn't work. It's a huge chronological and, frankly, a sociological problem. The Egyptian hieroglyph, the determinative they use for Israel on that stele, it designates a people or a nation.
Not just a city-state.
No. And to be capable of being devastated by the Egyptian army, Israel had to have been settled, organized, and present in Canaan for a long, long time, long enough to be seen as a threat.
The timeline required by the Ramesside Exodus theory just completely falls apart. They should have just been starting the conquest under Joshua, not being an established nation.
The trail makes it sound like Israel was an old existing problem for Egypt in 1209 BC, not a brand new one.
And that timeline conflict gets even more specific when you start looking at military hardware.
Yes, the chariot conundrum. This is fascinating.
This moves us from just inscriptions to actual temple reliefs.
Right. An Egyptologist named Frank Yurko did this really important analysis of the campaign scenes carved into the walls of the Karnak temple. He noticed something.
What was that?
Well, the reliefs detailed campaigns against the very same cities that are listed on the Merneptah stele Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam. So he reasoned that the battle against Israel must also be depicted somewhere in there.
That makes perfect sense. If the battle was important enough to carve into your big victory monument...
You definitely carve it onto a temple wall. It was a huge deal.
So did he find it?
He did. He located a very badly damaged scene within this complex of reliefs, but he was confident in identifying it as the battle against Israel.
And what does it show?
Even though it's damaged, you can clearly see the Egyptian pharaoh's powerful chariot charge. And fleeing in front of him is a small but identifiable enemy chariot.
An enemy chariot?
Yes, and the iconography is very specific. The horses of this enemy chariot have their heads bowed down in exhaustion. That was a standard Egyptian artistic convention for showing a routed enemy on the run for the triumphant pharaoh.
Okay, let's just unpack that single detail. An exhausted, defeated enemy chariot. If that enemy is Israel, as the conventional chronology would have it, then the entire historical structure just collapses. Why?
Because if you actually read the books of Exodus, Joshua, and Judges, they are crystal clear about what the early Israelite fighting force was like.
They were infantry.
Exclusively. A tribal confederation of guerrilla infantry. They explicitly, repeatedly state that they had no horses and no chariots.
And this wasn't just an oversight. It was a defining feature of their military. They were the underdog.
Absolutely. The text portrays them as being at a serious technological disadvantage. Their main enemies, the Canaanites, they had sophisticated chariot divisions. The Israelites had to use tactics and strategy to beat them.
Like in the Book of Judges with Deborah and Sisera?
A perfect example. They lure Sisera's 900 iron chariots down into a marshy river valley, the Kishon River. The chariots get bogged down, they become useless, and the Canaanite advantage is completely neutralized.
And there's more. When Joshua does conquer cities that have chariots,
The command is always to hamstring the horses and burn the chariots. They never, ever integrate them into their own army.
it's the ultimate contrast. So, if Yurko's identification of that relief at Karnak is correct, then Israel in the 13th century BC was fielding chariots.
Sophisticated military hardware, yes, which directly contradicts the entire biblical depiction of their army until centuries later.
Until King Solomon.
The first biblical mention of a real Israelite chariot army is under Solomon when he sets up chariot cities like Megiddo. So this one single picture of an Israelite chariot in the 13th century BC, it casts fatal doubt on the entire traditional dating.
The military facts from the Egyptian side, the archaeological side, and the biblical side are just mutually exclusive in the late Bronze Age.
They cannot all be true at the same time.
So, having established that the conventional chronology really fails on both the big geopolitical level and the specific military level, let's pivot.
Let's look at the physical evidence.
Where does the new chronology tell us to look for all that fire and collapse?
We have to shift our focus much, much earlier to the Middle Bronze Age, specifically MBIIB.
And when we do that,
The patterns of destruction suddenly just snap right into focus. And the most critical piece of evidence, the real anchor for the whole conquest timeline, has to be Jericho.
right, you can't have the conquest without the fall of Jericho. Joshua chapter 6, the famous story of the walls coming down. What did the archaeology actually show?
The detailed excavations there, done by people like Kathleen Kenyon, they revealed decisive evidence. The city from that period, what we call City 3, had massive fortifications. A huge stone revetment wall at the bottom of the mound with a mud brick wall on top,
And it was destroyed.
violently, by a massive fire.
Yeah.
But here is the monumental finding, that destruction happened during the Middle Bronze Age IIB, around 1550 BC in the NC model.
And what happened after that MBIIB destruction? That's the key, isn't it?
It's everything. A vast, long gap. The site was almost completely abandoned after the fire, meaning that during the entire late Bronze Age, the era of Ramses II, the traditional date for the conquest, there was no major fortified city at Jericho. It was just an insignificant ruin.
I mean, that one fact alone is enough to sink the late Bronze Age model. Joshua can't conquer a city that doesn't exist.
He can't. The only city there that matches the biblical description of a great fortified city was destroyed centuries before he supposedly arrived.
But the evidence gets even more specific, doesn't it? It connects back to the Exodus part of the story.
It does. We have to look at a tiny but critical artifact, a scarab.
Okay, tell us about the scarab.
In the cemeteries near Jericho, in a place called Tomb H13, a small scarab was found at the name of the Hyksos king Shishi.
And this tomb was special.
Very. It contained a large number of simultaneous multiple burials. The excavator, Kenyon, she theorized that these were victims of a sudden, really virulent plague that had swept through the city just before it was destroyed.
Ah, the plague connection. So let's connect the dots here for you. We have a sequence, a plague causing mass burials, followed very quickly by the violent, fiery destruction of the city.
And it's all happening during or just after the reign of this Hyksos king, Shishi.
Which lines up perfectly with the biblical narrative.
It's a stunning alignment. You have the plagues in Egypt, which was Hyksos-controlled territory, and then you have the fall of Jericho. The Shishi scarab links it all. We find his scarabs in the Hyksos capital of Avaris, the proposed Israelite settlement, and now here at Jericho, dating its destruction.
So the fall of Jericho is placed exactly during the collapse of Hyksos' power.
The MBIIB period, precisely where the new chronology says the conquest should be.
That is compelling. Okay, let's move to the next big problem site for biblical history, AI.
AI, which means the ruin. And the traditional site, a place called Et Tel, created huge problems.
What were they?
Well, first, it was massive, about 27 acres. And second, much more damagingly, it was completely empty during the late Bronze Age.
So again, the same problem as Jericho. You can't conquer a place that isn't there.
Exactly. For decades, the failure to find a conquered city at Ai was held up as one of the strongest arguments against the biblical text's historicity.
But the Bible itself describes AI as something smaller, doesn't it? More of a stronghold than a huge city.
It does, which led scholars to rethink the location. The text says Ai was east of Bethel. Once they got a better fix on where Bethel was, they started looking for a smaller fortified site to the east that actually had a destruction layer from the right time,
And this led them to a new candidate.
a place called Kerbet El Makatir.
And how does this site fit the profile better?
It sits on every level. It's small, only about 3 acres, so it's a manageable target for a swift military strike.
Okay.
And crucially, it was heavily fortified. We're talking walls up to 12 feet thick, so it was an important little stronghold.
And the most important part.
Its occupation ended in a violent, destructive fire. It was reduced to a ruin, the very definition of Ai.
So we have a small, fortified site, violently destroyed, matching the MBIIB destruction patterns, and it's located exactly where the Bible says it should be.
It's a much, much better fit than the old site. It suggests the biblical account was actually very precise, but that archaeologists were just looking in the wrong place.
Let's talk about the specific enemies they faced. It wasn't just about knocking down walls. It was about driving out a specific group, the Anakim.
Ah, the so-called giants.
Right.
The Anakim are fascinating. They represent the entrenched, powerful rulers. Some scholars have even linked the name Anak to the Indo-European word Anax, which means lord or chief.
So maybe not literal giants, but a dominant ruling class.
Potentially, yes. And the Bible says that after the main conquests, their final refuge was a major city called Sheruhin.
And we can identify Sherahan archaeologically.
Yes, with a site called Tel El-Ejul near Gaza. It was a massive strategic port city, and critically, it was a major Hyksos stronghold during the MBIIB period.
And this is where that King Sheshi connection comes back in.
It's the thread that ties the whole narrative together. We trace King Sheshi from Avaris, the site of the Exodus, to Jericho, the first conquest, and now to Sheruhin, the final refuge of these Anakim, these Hyksos lords.
Let me guess. They found his scarabs there too.
They did. Scarabs with King Sheshi's name were found at Tel El-Ejul, both right before and right after the partial destruction of the city.
So this directly ties the biblical story of driving out the Anakim to the historical collapse of Hyksos power in Canaan.
Yes, the biblical conquest in the NC model becomes a key part of the historical end of the Second Intermediate Period. It wasn't an impossible invasion against a superpower. It was a campaign during a time of widespread regional collapse and a power vacuum.
That makes so much more sense from a military and political perspective.
It's plausible. The expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt by Pharaoh Ahmose created chaos. Their strongholds in Canaan were vulnerable. The Israelite conquest, targeting these leftover lords, these Anakim, would have been a campaign against a crumbling system.
Okay, so once the destruction phase is over, the Israelites have to establish their own identity, their own worship.
Right. And this brings us to the founding of the cult centers we read about in Joshua and Judges.
And Shechem is probably the most impressive example.
Tel Balatah, modern Shechem. The book of Joshua describes this profound spiritual moment there. The tribes all gather and swear allegiance to Yahweh in front of a great standing stone, a massabah, the covenant stone ceremony.
What did excavators find at Tel Balatah?
They found the foundations of an absolutely immense temple tower from the MBIIB period, a monumental structure.
And this temple?
It was built on a massive platform of fill, which is why the Book of Judges later calls it Beit Milo, the house of the filling. It's definitively identified as the Temple of Baal Berith, the Lord of the Covenant.
Which is the name used in the Bible.
Exactly. Or Migdal Shechem, the Tower of Shechem. Both terms are used.
So the location matches, but what about that specific covenant stone?
This is the amazing part. Right in front of the entrance to this huge MBIIB temple, they found the lower section of a massive erected stone, the massabah, still sitting securely in its original socket.
Wow.
Finding this specific, large standing stone right in front of the main covenant temple from that period, for proponents of the MP, this is the physical spot of Joshua's covenant stone ceremony. It anchors the whole spiritual climax of the conquest right into the MBIIB archaeological reality.
That is incredibly specific, and the history of that temple continues to track with the biblical story right into the period of the Judges.
It does. The same massive temple complex was later violently destroyed by fire.
And this corresponds to?
The story of King Abimelech in Judges chapter 9. He burns the tower down with all its inhabitants during this period of tribal infighting after the death of Gideon.
So you have the consecration of the site in Joshua and its later destruction in Judges, both happening within the MBIIB timeframe.
It provides this remarkable archaeological continuity that spans centuries of the biblical narrative.
And that continuity extends from Shechem to the next spiritual capital, Shiloh.
Right. Shiloh was the central spot for the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle for the entire period of the Judges. It was the heart of the tribal confederation.
So, when did the Bible need Shiloh to exist as a sanctuary, and when does archaeology say it was first occupied?
Well, according to the conventional chronology, the Judges period is mostly in the Iron Age nest, starting around 1200 BC.
But the archaeology at Shiloh showed something very different.
A profound mismatch. The excavations revealed that Shiloh was first occupied definitively during the MBIIB period. In the NC timeline, that's the 14th to 13th centuries BC.
That is centuries earlier than the CC would allow for the Judges period.
Centuries.
Yeah.
And this initial MBIIB occupation was serious. It was structured. It was defensive. They built a massive artificial platform using a large glacis wall around the site.
So it was an important fortified central settlement capable of housing a national shrine, and it existed in the Middle Bronze Age.
Exactly. At the right time, in the right place for the Book of Judges to begin if you use the new chronology, it's a perfect fit. The first Yahwist cult center appears and thrives exactly when the NC says it should.
So let's step back and look at the whole pattern. By shifting the timeline, we move away from the late Bronze Age, where the conquest story is impossible. No destroyed cities, peak Egyptian power.
And we move into the MBIIB, where everything starts to click. Destruction of Jericho, Shechem, the sudden emergence of cult sites like Shiloh, it all aligns with the biblical sequence.
But this brings us back to that first big criticism that seemed to sink the whole idea of a conquest. Finkelstein's finding of population continuity.
Right. If there was this violent invasion, why did the early Israelite villagers look like indigenous Canaanites? It's a fair question.
How does the new chronology reconcile the destruction of the big cities with that continuity in the countryside?
It proposes a really crucial reinterpretation of what conquest and settlement actually meant on the ground. The old assumption was that conquest meant total population replacement and the immediate construction of new permanent villages.
And the lack of those villages seemed to prove Finkelstein right.
But the biblical text itself suggests something different, doesn't it? Especially for those early years.
It describes a more semi-nomadic lifestyle.
Exactly. The NC model suggests that the early post-conquest life for the Israelites was as tribal, semi-nomadic groups living mainly in tents. They weren't building huge stone villages right away. They were pastoralists.
So Finkelstein's observation, the lack of new built settlements, actually supports this idea.
It fits perfectly. The indigenous Canaanite population could have remained, maybe paying tribute or just living under the new Israelite tribal leadership. The conquest was political and military, not a total demographic replacement.
They took out the leadership, the elite Anakim, in their strongholds. But the average person in the hill country might have just experienced a change in who was in charge.
It's a crucial intellectual shift. It turns the main archaeological argument against the conquest into evidence that actually supports the specific early Israelite lifestyle that the Bible describes.
It resolves the paradox.
It does. The destruction layers prove the military campaign, and the population continuity proves the semi-nomadic settlement phase.
Let's close this out by just hammering home that critical difference in geopolitical context that the NC provides.
The fatal flaw of the conventional chronology is that it puts this invasion attempt right at the peak of Egyptian military power, the 19th dynasty Ramses II. His control over Canaan was absolute. He had garrisons everywhere.
The idea that a group of escaped slaves could march in and dismantle fortified cities while Ramses' army was actively campaigning in the area, it just borders on the impossible.
It's highly, highly improbable. But the new chronology places the conquest at the end of MBIIB.
A time when Egyptian military control was profoundly weak.
Yes, following the expulsion of the Hyksos and the collapse of the Middle Kingdom's influence. It was an era of collapse, devastation, and power vacuums. That weak environment provides the perfect window of opportunity for the massive upheaval described in the book of Joshua to have actually happened.
So the whole story moves from being dismissed as a myth invented centuries later
To becoming a potentially historical account that's been preserved accurately, just misdated by modern scholarship. When we shift the framework, the stories suddenly find these compelling anchors in the Middle Bronze Age.
We've examined the sources, sifted through the conflicting chronologies, and found that when we adjust the timeline, the fictional stories suddenly find compelling and remarkably specific anchors in the Middle Bronze Age archaeological record. Jericho's walls destroyed by fire, Ai's smaller fort annihilated, Shechem's covenant stone in place, and Shiloh established precisely when the biblical narrative claims it should have been.
It's a powerful reminder that our conventional assumptions about dating can sometimes obscure the very patterns of evidence we are seeking. The key takeaway is not just that the conquest might have happened, but that its specific details, military technology, settlement pattern, and timing relative to Egypt's strength, are better accounted for by the collapse phase of the Middle Bronze Age than by the conventional 13th century timeline. It raises the essential question of how much other mythological history is simply suffering from a misstated historical context.
That brings us to the end of this deep dive into the archaeological and historical contexts of the Exodus and the conquest. We want to thank you for sharing your sources and joining us on this investigative journey.
If you enjoyed this deep dive, please interact with us, share the channel, and invite them to subscribe to the English BookCast channel here on YouTube.